ads. The presidential candidate has hit back, while the Prime Minister refused to defend Dame Angela. Plus, the Darlington nurse whistleblowers have revealed that they were forced to use a tiny locker room to get changed in after complaining about a biological male being in the women's changing rooms. The nurses join me in a moment. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my panel, former Conservative Cabinet Minister John Redwood and the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. As ever, let me know your views. It's a crucial part of the programme. mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's your favourite time of the day, the News Bulletin with Mark White.
Good evening to you. The main headlines from the GB News Centre. Dozens of prisoners allowed out of jail under the government's emergency release programme were freed by mistake. The Ministry of Justice has confirmed that 37 people were released mistakenly on the 10th of September because their offences were wrongly logged. This meant these cases slipped through the safeguards, which are there to ensure those convicted of certain crimes would not be released. Most of those freed by mistake have now been returned to custody, but 5 prisoners are still at large. A Downing Street spokesman said tonight that all those freed offenders have been monitored since their release, so they will be brought back into prison. The Prime Minister has told GB News there are legitimate concerns over migration levels. Sir Keir said he tended to agree that those levels were too high, but he told our political editor, Christopher Hope, that those concerns were no excuse for violence.
You understand, people have legitimate concerns about immigration, and we should debate them. And where they say to me, we think migration is too high, then I tend to agree with that. And the reason is because, well, among the reasons is because of the skills failure over the last years, and we need to fix that. Many people across the country are concerned about immigration, but they wouldn't for a minute go onto the street and throw a brick at a police officer. And I think it is wrong to pretend that they are one and the same. They are not.
The Prime Minister was speaking ahead of his speech to the United Nations, where he called for British nationals in Lebanon to leave immediately. The Prime Minister said 700 additional UK troops, as well as aircraft and ships, were on standby in Cyprus to evacuate Britons if necessary. Warning sirens sounded in Tel Aviv earlier as a missile was intercepted by air defence systems after it was detected crossing from Lebanon. The Hezbollah terror group has confirmed it launched a missile targeting Mossad headquarters. It claims the intelligence agency is responsible for assassinating leaders and the massive pager bomb attacks in Lebanon last week. The Prime Minister is at the centre of fresh controversy over a decision to accept several weeks' accommodation at a luxury property in London. The accommodation was made available by Labour donor Lord Ali, and the stay was valued at around £20,000. Sir Keir defended his decision to accept the offer, saying it was because his son needed somewhere to revise for his GCSEs. He said the family home was besieged by journalists during the election campaign. And finally, it's a rise, Sir Alan Bates, the leading campaigner for sub-postmasters during the Horizon scandal, received his knighthood from Princess Anne at Windsor Castle today. The 70-year-old fought a long campaign after he and more than 700 other sub-postmasters fell victim to a faulty IT system which wrongly accused them of stealing from their post office branches. Well, congratulations to him, a well-deserved award, and now it's back to Jacob.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. Labour's sleaze problem won't go away as a greedy and entitled Prime Minister gets tetchy with the media when it dares to quiz him about governmental arrangements. In the midst of this row, the unrepentant Lady Starmer yesterday wore another lone Freebie frock to attend the Labour Party conference. And it then emerged that the Prime Minister had been using Lord Alley's £18 million Covent Garden apartment during the election campaign. The Telegraph reported that it understood that the luxury penthouse was being used for strategy meetings and fundraising dinners. However, on Radio 4 this morning, the Prime Minister sank to a new level. He used his son as a human shield. He has defended the use of the apartment on the grounds that his son needed somewhere quiet to study for his GCSEs. Well, I know the Bible says the sins of the father will be visited upon the son, but I didn't think it would ever be the other way round. But upon closer inspection of Starmer's declaration concerning the free use of the apartment, which cost £20,400, something doesn't quite fit. Starmer declared his use of the flat from the 29th of May 2024 to the 13th of July 2024. But GCSEs started on the 9th of May and ended on the 19th of June. In other words, the allegedly essential use of the apartment began weeks after GCSEs started and ended nearly a month after GCSEs had finished. So if the apartment were used for his son's GCSEs, what was going on in the apartment for the 3 weeks after they had ended? Starmer's efforts to cover up over Donagate mean he will not recover from it. He has used the classic politician's defence. I did nothing wrong. It was within the rules. Everyone does it. But now I won't do it again. He and other ministers said they would no longer take freebie clothing now they're in office, especially after the hostility from Labour backbenchers and members. But then yesterday, we saw another freebie on display from Lady Starmer in an entitled, if not arrogant, approach to the scandal. Or perhaps the masters just want to rub our noses in their overweening superiority as she wore another dress that was not her own. And now, when it emerges he's been using Lord Alley's apartment, his dishonesty with the public, as was shown with Christopher Hope earlier today.
Well, all that happened is I wanted somewhere safe and quiet for my son to do his GCSE preparation. I needed it to be secure because of the situation we were in. Simply somebody saying, if you want somewhere quiet for your son to study whilst he's doing your GCSE, you can use this place here.
So not only has the Reverend Starmer decided rather ungallantly to throw his son under the bus, he's also decided to be economical with the truth, as the dates do not match the GCSE timetable. There really is no recovery from this. Donagate will haunt him as much as sausages will for the rest of his time in office. As always, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm very pleased to be joined now by the broadcast journalist Matthew Stadlen, as well as my panel, former Conservative Cabinet Minister John Redwood and the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. Matthew, people need to get their facts right. Dare I say it, though I supported him, this is beginning to sound very like Boris Johnson, that somebody says something went wrong, you say, no, it didn't, it's all fine. Then they find another detail and you say, well, perhaps that happened. And then you give an explanation that doesn't quite add up. And this is exactly what Starmer's done. But he was so high and mighty when it was Boris.
Well, two questions. One, why did you support Boris Johnson?
I supported Boris Johnson because I thought that what he had done was not serious and wasn't a major problem, and that he said things in good faith. But here we're having somebody who always thought that any Tory doing anything like this was shameful, and now he's doing more and worse himself, particularly as there's now an allegation in the Telegraph, but it's also been on Guido, that he was using Lord Alley's flat to make statements during COVID lockdowns.
So Boris Johnson, as was found by a committee of your fellow parliamentarians, lied to Parliament, deliberately misled Parliament. But I don't want to indulge in too much whataboutery because it's absolutely right that this government is held to account. What is it exactly that you think that Keir Starmer has done wrong?
He has taken excessive hospitality and support for things that most people would expect somebody to pay for themselves. So the free dresses for his wives, most men wouldn't want other men paying for their wives' dresses. And actually, on this housing, saying it was for a purpose that the facts don't match, it's the cover-up that seems to me to be much worse than borrowing a flat from a donor.
But covering up what? as you say.
Well, I don't know.
As you say, he was accepting this flat, or the use of the flat. He's declared that, and I think we need to be very careful, because in your opening, in your monologue, you talked about the dodginess of this.
Yeah, but it is dodgy, because he
it's
says
not
he's...
dodgy. Dodgy implies, I think, at least to some extent, implies criminality or corruption.
No, I don't think it implies criminality.
There's no suggestion of any of those things, is there?
It doesn't imply criminality, but it is dodgy, because he said he needed it for his son's GCSEs, but he moved the family in the middle of the GCSEs and then stayed for the 3 weeks after they'd ended. This was just not true.
Well, I'm not Keir Starmer. I'm certainly not his spokesman. I've never been asked to be his spokesman. I broadly supported his efforts to get into number 10, and I can certainly see that some of the optics here are far from ideal. But we've got to be careful, again, before we start accusing people of being dodgy. Now, it may well be the case that his primary need for that flat, as he saw it, was for his son to be able to do their GCSEs. There may have been other uses as well, and I'm sure my colleagues in the world of journalism will follow up on that. But this is a programme that is called, quite literally, isn't it, The State of the Nation. And what I find a shame is that we are talking about these issues at all, not because they're not legitimate to be asked about, but I worry that journalists find these as easy goals to score, because this, don't forget, we should remind the viewers, Jacob, this is all openly available to everyone at home because they have been declared. We are on a precipice. The state of this nation, thanks in part to 14 years of Tory rule, this nation stands on a precipice, and I don't mean this as a rhetorical device. We have an NHS in crisis. We have social care in crisis. Our armed forces, dare I say it, are in crisis. Our transport system is in relative crisis. There is a cost of living crisis still, and we are talking about things that have been openly declared.
And in a cost of living crisis, we have a Prime Minister who takes £107,000 worth of freebies.
I see the optics are not good. I agree with that.
Tessa, the thing that concerns me most about this is the hypocrisy. That Starmer was so pious about all of this, and then his snout is in the trough more than anybody else. 2.5 times more freebies for Starmer than any other Member of Parliament.
He made an error of judgment, and he's made it quite clear he won't do it again. He was in opposition, i.e. not in the equivalent position of power he now finds himself in. I tend to agree with the Right Honourable Matthew on the other side of the desk in terms of let's get our priorities right here. And I've got to check GB News on its journalism. In fact, Victoria Starmer, in, I thought, a stunning red dress worth over £1,000, lest anyone's thinking of buying it at home, was lent to her by a Canadian-British designer.
But it was therefore free.
But it was totally disingenuous to suggest, because we know that she did get funding for her dresses from Lord Ali, and you said in your monologue, you know, other men buying her dresses. In the same breath, you said she was wearing a free dress. That was from a female designer, and it was loaned. It was showing off the best of British.
Once again, she was taking a freebie.
She was showing off the best of British. You should admire that. You believe in free market forces.
I just think it's so arrogant in the midst of this sort of a row to carry on taking freebies when all the other cabinet ministers have said they won't take free dresses anymore.
A loan that showed off a British label.
John, the hypocrisy of this is the problem, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. It is a problem that they created because they were remorseless in picking over every little peccadillo of Conservative ministers, some genuine, some not. And they were never forgiving, and they never thought that anything was reasonable. And now we find that they've been doing the same or worse on a huge scale that a lot of Conservatives wouldn't have dreamt of doing. And you have to challenge their judgment. I mean, these things may all have been within the rules, but they were a gross political misjudgment, which is why they've had 2 weeks of news bulletins about practically nothing else.
From the predominantly right-wing press. Come on, meat on the bone for you guys.
This is Labour briefings of the press. We don't have that power on the Conservative side, I can assure you.
I genuine sympathy.
The conference was very hostile on all this. And so then, instead of saying, no, we're absolutely sure what we did was right morally as well as within the law, and we're going to carry on doing it, they then say they're going to dump a lot of it. So that looks extremely guilty. So then they do make themselves look hypocritical.
Don't you have a degree of sympathy with Starmer? We we know he's been very wary of the impact on his two youngish adolescent children, my boy, my girl. We don't even get to know their names. And suddenly the juggernaut of the press, he doesn't know when the election's going to be called. He hits the panic button. And incidentally, if you're wondering what happens after the GCSEs
I think
in
the
an
press
empty flat,
doesn't do
it's called
that.
a party.
I had the juggernaut of the press when I was challenging John Major when I had young children at home, and the press were extremely good with the children. They didn't go anywhere near them.
Could I just widen this out very, very briefly, if I may? Are you two gentlemen who have been MPs, and you said off air you've never accepted a sort of hospitality-type gift, that sort of freebie, and good for you for that, although it's also true that you're a man of impressive means, I think. But are you suggesting that MPs should get no gifts whatsoever? I rather like that idea myself, but let's make sure that it is cross-party.
I think MPs should be very careful about the hospitality that they accept.
The problem with gifts,
careful.
the problem with gifts, if I may say, is, and I've defended Starmer on the basis that he has declared these things. The problem with gifts is that even if you declare things, and this isn't just about Starmer, this is about all 650 MPs in the House of Commons. The problem is that just because you've declared it doesn't mean that you are immune then to be influenced by the... Or not just criticism, but you're not immune, I don't think, from influence from the donor. Well, so just because you've declared it doesn't mean you might not be influenced.
Well, that's the point I was making. It can be a big moral and political misjudgment, even if it's perfectly legal.
That is a great...
Some hospitality is fine. I mean, if you are the Prime Minister or the Culture Secretary, and one of our nations or countries is playing a very important game and you're invited as an official guest, then of course you should go.
If you're a local MP,
what you shouldn't do is say, I've got a pet team I want to watch as regularly as possible, and will somebody please fund me for doing that? No, that's personal leisure. You pay for yourself.
And we've ended on a wonderful degree of agreement that even if it's declared, there's still an intention. Where there's a tip, there's a tap. On the COVID broadcast, the Prime Minister's press secretary said that no COVID rules had been broken by the use of the flat for the broadcast, but they have admitted the flat was used. Thank you to Matthew and to my distinguished panel. In a moment, we'll be going live to New York in the light of the Prime Minister's address to the United Nations as the Middle East is on the brink of full-scale war.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
And feelings of stress and anxiety tend to be quite normal for a lot of kids. And if it's normal for the kids, then it affects the parents as well.
Well, it seems that our canine friends could be the cure after new research by the University of Bristol found that dogs are incredibly sensitive to their owners' emotions. OK,
how do we cheat into this? How can your doggy help your family handle stress during this time of the year? Let's go to the Director of Canine Affairs at Guide Dogs UK, Tim Stafford. Tim, we're talking about this as if it's a big revelation, but obviously, you know, a man like yourself, you're well used to this, and you can see when a dog is reacting. What form would that reaction take, do you think?
Yeah, you know what? It's nice when the science kind of confirms what most of us have known for a very long time. Our dogs become members of our family and they come very, very close to us. So it's no surprise that anything that goes on in the family is going to be detected and picked up by the dog. That can be changes in behaviours. It can certainly be the dogs watching our behaviours and starting to mirror those behaviours. But what this research says is that the dogs can actually smell our emotions. It's not just that they're responding to our behaviour changes, they're responding to our physiological changes as well, because we smell differently when we start to get anxious. So at this time, there's lots of changes in a lot of families' lives. Kids are going back to school, young people are going to university, parents are having to deal with all of the emotions attached to that. So it's no surprise that our dogs start to detect that too.
GB News, the People's Channel.
This is Britain's newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
The king of breakfast TV is back. That's right, Britain's favourite TV host, Eamon Holmes, returns to Britain's hottest breakfast programme. Breakfast every day from 6 a.m. only on GB News. Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
down to earth,
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
and most importantly, honest,
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and once again we've been talking about Donagate, the sleaze row that won't go away, and the mail mogs have come in. Philip says, "Hi, Sir Jacob. Why would Starmer take so much from one man, Ali? It's not like Keir is short of money. Starmer is meant to be a highly intelligent man. Well, clearly, he's not the sharpest tool in the box, but his father was, I believe, a tool maker, so perhaps his father should have made sharper tools." Chris says, Chris, you're a nice and generous figure. I may sympathise with Starmer if he still pays for his Arsenal season ticket, thus putting some money up for his director's box. Has anyone asked him? I think, to be fair to him, he did say on the wireless earlier on today that he does pay still for a season ticket for both himself and for his son. In his first speech as Prime Minister of the United Nations in New York City today, Sir Keir Starmer promised that His Majesty's government will produce global leadership as the world faces conflicts in both the Middle East and Ukraine. He demanded that the Security Council calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but he did not reiterate his call for the release of sausages on this occasion. He managed to get it right and called for the release of all hostages held by Hamas. With Israel and Hezbollah on the brink of full-scale war, who better to speak to than Colonel Richard Kemp, former British Army commander? Richard, thank you very much for joining me. How high is the risk at the moment, and what developments are you expecting?
Well, the IDF has been doing enormous damage to Hezbollah in the last few days, in the last week perhaps, enormous damage. And this, of course, is in the wake of thousands of rockets being fired into northern Israel by Hezbollah since the 8th of October. I think it can only probably escalate further than it has already. We've seen today, just today, we saw missiles fired from, or a missile at least, fired from by Hezbollah from Lebanon towards Tel Aviv, which was thankfully intercepted. That's the first time this has happened. So I think that, that if that continues, if attempts by Hezbollah to reach further and further south into Israel continues, I think the IDF will have little choice other than to go on the ground and launch a full-scale ground offensive to deal with Hezbollah. That might happen anyway. But I know there are a lot of efforts going on at the moment between the Americans and the Israelis to try and calm things down to an extent as best as can be done. So I think it's very much open as to whether we're going to see an all-out war, which includes ground troops, or whether just going to see a continuation of the rocket fire from Hezbollah and the retaliation or the defensive action by Israel to deal with Hezbollah.
And what action is Iran taking at the moment? Is it acting as a restraining force on Hezbollah, or will it be saying to them, use more of your missiles?
I think Hezbollah has been almost begging Iran to join in this fight, and Iran, I think, are reluctant to do so for obvious reasons. They themselves don't want to suffer any more damage to their country, as a result of further attacks on Israel. So I think I wouldn't say they're necessarily restraining Hezbollah. Of course, Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. It's an element of Iran. But what they don't want to happen, I think, is for Hezbollah to be annihilated by Israel, which is what will happen if it escalates into an all-out conflict. It may take time. It may be very, very hard. But ultimately, I think Israel's going to prevail. And Iran doesn't want that because the rockets in Lebanon, the Hezbollah rockets, originally about 150,000, maybe a few less now, are designed to act as a deterrent against Israel from attacking Iran. So I think it needs to keep that proxy in place if it can.
And what effect do you think Israel's attack last week via the pagers will have had on the operation of Hezbollah? How capable is it, and how affected would it have been by that attack?
I think it was quite a devastating attack. It was very, very obviously planned well ahead, very precise attack aimed at killing or wounding Hezbollah terrorists who are attacking Israel. And I think it will have been very damaging, not just in terms of taking out some of the leadership, and quite a significant number of the leadership, but also in damaging their ability to communicate. Both pagers and radios were taken out of action. And also, it'll have a massive psychological impact on Hezbollah. They won't know what to do next. And they've also lost, I think, quite considerable cohesion among the organisation, on top of which they've had several very, very high-level leaders taken out by other Israeli precision strikes. So I think I would say Hezbollah right now is probably reeling. It's not, its danger hasn't gone, but I think it's been written down quite significantly.
Well, thank you very much, Colonel. With me now is my panel, former Conservative Cabinet Minister John Redwood and the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. John, the Prime Minister's gone to the United Nations. We obviously want the Prime Minister, when he's on the world stage, to speak effectively for the nation. In reality, what influence do you think the UK has directly and as an ally of the United States?
Well, I think we have very little influence over Israel. We supply practically no weapons and obviously don't aid Israel in any direct way, although we have strong bonds and friendships as a fellow democracy. But he must do the best he can. And yes, we send our best wishes to him. He represents all of us we trust. And I'm sure most people in this country want to try and find a negotiated peace solution in both conflicts in the Middle East and are sincere in wanting to do so. But I don't think we're going to be the decisive influence. I think President Biden is struggling to get any influence, and he is a very major supporter of Israel in very practical ways.
And Israel has felt, quite understandably, since 7th of October last year, very much under attack by people who want to wipe it out. So it's quite hard to say to them, don't do anything, or have a ceasefire, when your enemies are terrorists who have no intention of having a ceasefire.
Well, of course it is. And we were all horrified by what started this latest round of conflicts with the terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians in trying to enjoy themselves in their own country peacefully. But then you get bad things happening on both sides. And the question a friend has to ask Israel is, how do they see the end game? Because it's very difficult to see that they can have such a military victory that suddenly there's no more terrorism. Because we know that terrorists breed and multiply and recruit if you kill some, others emerge, and they have grudges. And so you have to be very careful not to let your retaliation get to the point where it creates more terrorism.
Tessa, you were saying in the break that one of your great concerns is that what's going on here is taking attention away from Ukraine. Yeah. In the balance of importance, which one do you think is more crucial to global security?
I think they're both terrifyingly interconnected. But the greatest Jewish leader of our time, Volodymyr Zelensky, desperately needs our help, our commitment and our attention.
Our attention? Because he's not getting any attention.
He's not getting any attention. And actually, I've got to say, I'm disappointed with Starmer. I'm not surprised, but it's the same old language. You talked about the Israel's surrounding neighbours wanting to wipe them out. But actually, what has happened since October last year in the horrific attacks is Israel effectively wiping out large parts of Gaza. He talked, Keir Starmer, of the 105 hostages still remaining with Hamas and puts that on an equivocal level with what's happened in Gaza. 40,000 plus individual civilians, predominantly children, dead. Those two aren't equivocal.
Well,
I think we need to stand back.
Those numbers are disputed by the Israelis, to be fair.
Thousands, tens of thousands of Gazans. You just need to look at the satellite pictures. But you just need to look. Even the number of aid workers, many of them, some of them British aid workers, 200 plus aid workers have been killed.
But the Israeli government has pointed out consistently that its success rate of taking out terrorists proportionate to civilian casualties is much higher than we achieved in either Afghanistan or Iraq. They are taking their obligations under international law very seriously.
We know that the strapline that many now just consider hollow PR, that they're the most moral army in the world. I'm sorry, I thought it was absolutely grotesque, that pager and telecommunications attack, taking out eyes, taking out fingers, killing surrounding children and civilians. It felt like a terror attack because of the collateral damage surrounding the individuals.
Who had those pagers
but they weren't the only ones affected.
Anyway, thank you to my panel. In a moment, Dame Andrew Eagle has levelled some pretty serious accusations against the great Donald Trump. But it seems the former president has no idea who she is. Plus, the OECD has predicted an upgrade on our GDP growth forecast. Is this really a cause for celebration?
Hi there, welcome to the latest forecast from the Met Office for GB News. Rain for many of us over the next 24 hours, heavy in places once again, but there will be a few clear spells around, particularly in the far south and the far north. As this low pressure sends its frontal systems north, they will stall across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England during the rest of the day. And that rain will turn heavy at times, especially for southeast Scotland, northeast England, where there is the risk of localised flooding through the day on Thursday because of the amount of rain we're expecting to fall. Further south, showers soon follow the main area of rain, a gusty wind and a mild night to come. A colder night for northern Scotland, where there will be some sunshine first thing on Thursday. Actually, Caithness, Sutherland, Western Scotland, the place to be for blue skies during Thursday morning. Showers, though, will start to move in from the north. Some patchy cloud around through central Scotland, but south of the central belt we've got a lot of damp weather, as well as for Northern Ireland we'll see outbreaks of rain, but the heaviest rain will be affecting North Wales and northern England. Like I say, there's going to be some significant accumulations in places, particularly the North York Moors and the Pennines through the morning and early afternoon. To the south, across parts of the Midlands, East Anglia, the south of England and South Wales, a mixture of sunny spells, but also some blustery showers and some rumbles of thunder as well. These showers are going to be fairly lively, but we've got mild air moving back in, 17 or 18 Celsius, whilst cold air affects northern parts of the country. That cold air spreads south during Friday after some heavy rain first thing through the M4 corridor into the M5 as well. Could cause some problems during the morning rush, but that rain does move through, and then brighter skies for many and a chill in the air as northerly winds arrive, so a cold start to the weekend, but Saturday and Sunday are looking much brighter with highs of 15 or 16 Celsius.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us! Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way.
Might be cold in this studio.
That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We were talking about Keir Starmer at the UN and his speech. And Craig says, good evening, Sir Jacob. The strapline across the bottom of the screen says that troops have been deployed in order possibly to rescue over 10,000 British nationals from Lebanon. What are they still doing there in the first place? And why is the British government paying to bring them back? Surely anyone with an ounce of common sense would have left months ago. That's a not unfair point. So Keir Starmer, back to him, was quick to chastise his immigration minister, Dame Angela Eagle, when she suggested that Trump had galvanised racists in the UK. Trump's spokesman responded to Eagle's comments dismissively, referring to Eagle as a nobody, and the Prime Minister reiterated on his way to the US that he had been absolutely clear where responsibility for the riots lies with the rioters, not, amazingly, with the former President of the United States. Well, my genius panel is still with me, former Conservative Cabinet Minister John Redwood and the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. Tessa, I imagine that if you're American, you wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. I hope that's not unfair. But it's not very wise of a senior government minister to attack one of the candidates in the US presidential election, is it?
No, but once again, this has been mendaciously reported. And so far as she did list the culpable governments and organisations who had stiffened racial rhetoric and included the former Conservative administration. But of course, we've plucked the Donald Trump line because it is not conducive to favourable relations with possibly the future President of the United States
But
of
Tessa,
America.
this is the difference between being a backbench MP and being a minister. And that when you're a backbench MP, you can make these sorts of comments and it's fine. When you're a minister, the government speaks with one voice. So suddenly the government has made a formal attack on Donald Trump and said he's a racist.
I actually think that for once the Trump administration got it right by deriding her as something of a nobody. I mean, she's hardly like front-line cabinet. And to be honest, I thought on a sentimental level, she has a point. We've seen the coarsening of global rhetoric around migration, around othering, the degrading of certain categories of human, so that actually, in the end, those out on the streets, less well-educated, less well-informed, less well-endowed, believe they can take the law into their own hands.
I actually think Tessa's unfair on Angela Eagle, who, in my time in Parliament, was an assiduous parliamentarian. She was always there, always contributing, ran for leadership of the Labour Party to try and get rid of the hard left, Jeremy Corbyn. I've never thought she was a bad person, and I thought she was rather an impressive parliamentarian. So, though dismissing her as a nobody's clever politics, it's not really true. She is quite important.
Oh, she's very important, and she's in the government, and as you say, she speaks for the government, so that is why
She's a minor Home Office
Look, let me
minister.
have my word.
No, I'm just, OK. But...
Yeah, you know, when you're in the government, you speak for the government, and that's why the Prime Minister's rightly had to slap her down and say that she doesn't speak for the government on this. She should be ashamed of herself. She's a very experienced politician, and she should know rule one when you're a government minister is you do not interfere in anybody else's elections. You don't say anything about the candidates or the parties or the policies in the crucial run-up period as we now are in America. Everybody knows that, so why did this woman do it? She did it deliberately. She was provocative. She thought she could get away with it to please left-wingers in her audience, and she's now in the middle of a row, and I hope she loses her job, because this is not good enough for a senior minister.
And it's not in the interests of the United Kingdom that Donald Trump may win, and the most important foreign policy objective of British government is to have a good relationship with the United States, whoever the president is.
The most important, because going back to our previous conversation, we need to keep them backing Ukraine, and that's the one thing where Trump is thoroughly equivocal. I don't condone her behaviour. I'm afraid, to an extent, it doesn't surprise me entirely. I think when you're new into government, you'd spent a long time, 14 years, the Conservatives got used to having their handle on the tiller and still made mistakes. Things slip. You make mistakes. She made a mistake. It was poor diplomacy. It's nothing Keir with his £3,000 spectacles can't manage when he's over there. I don't worry about that.
But actually it's part of a pattern, because we had Andrew Gwynn saying that he'd closed the pubs early, and then Dame Angela coming out and attacking Donald Trump. Governments need discipline, otherwise they don't work.
But particularly, as you say, on this crucial relationship, because everybody agrees that you have to get on with the President of the United States, and it's not for us to decide who should be the President of the United States or try and influence who should be President of the United States. Every government has to deal with the President who comes along, and it is a crucial alliance relationship. And so you work away at finding bridges and common ground, even if you're different parties.
And very briefly, we both recall that John Major's administration tried helping George Bush Sr. against Clinton, and that was a terrible mistake and very bad for British interests.
Well, and Obama helpfully intervened in our referendum to help the side that he wasn't trying to help.
Oh, the Obama intervention, I loved it. It won more votes for Brexit than Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage put together, pretty much. Anyway, economic growth forecast for the UK are allegedly looking up. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has increased its prediction for UK GDP growth in 2024 from 0.4% to 1.1%. This is the biggest upgrade of any G7 country. However, is this being seen through the Prime Minister's expensive rose-tinted spectacles? Seems to me that growth of 1.1% is a pretty miserable state of affairs, especially from an organisation that is almost always wrong. John, we ought to be getting trend growth of 2.5% to 3%, shouldn't we?
Well, of course we should, and I hope the government is trying to do that, because that's what they need to do if they're going to meet their wonderful promise that we're going to be the fastest growing of the G7. But, of course, the irony of this, they do nearly always get it wrong, and they're normally far too pessimistic about a Conservative-led Britain. And the joke is that this revision now, that we've done most of it in the first half before the Conservatives are thrown out of office, so it doesn't leave very much to be done by gloomy Starmer, who is talking the growth rate down as we sit here.
And it gives the lie to Labour's argument that the Tories had ruined everything because actually the economy is beginning to pick up, interest rates beginning to fall, inflation under control. It's actually not a bad economic inheritance.
No, the first half of this year, the Tories actually got it right at last, and we were the fastest growing, and we had inflation back down to 2%. That was what Labour say their aim is. I bet they won't do that for the rest of the year.
I've got to pick you up. I'm so sorry. One of the reasons why we won't feel the impact of this remarkable, 1.2% growth, is because we are going to have stubbornly persistent inflation in comparison with the other G7 members. And the reasons for that, because after our conversation last week...
The wage increases will be the reason for that.
And that is because of labour shortages, which is partly because of Brexit, also because of our food pricing.
Not because of Brexit. Yeah, We've had much more immigration since we left the European Union. We've had plenty of people coming in to...
Why do we have more acute worker shortages in this country?
The jobs.
Why do we have more acute
Well, because we've got, 1 million people who are on the sick who shouldn't be on it, and we've got 5 million people who are not entering employment, who could enter employment. We've got enormous numbers of people, so we need to deal with the benefit system to get people back into work.
That's right. I've just remembered, because of the ballooning NHS waiting list, that they're not actually fit to work. Just quickly, before we blow our trumpet too much, GDP, you mentioned it. In the G7, our English-speaking neighbour, the Republic of Ireland, isn't in the G7, but it outstrips us, almost doubles us in terms of their GDP growth. Do you know, GDP per capita in Southern Ireland, thanks to us really, and after Brexit, all those big companies going to Dublin, sits at $86,000 ahead compared to Britain, which is about $45,000
What's its corporation
ahead.
tax rate?
I don't know the details, but I'm just telling you, you're better off in Ireland.
It happened well before Brexit. It was because they very sensibly went for the kind of corporation tax rate Jacob and I wanted and the others didn't want. And so, yes, they have double the income per head of the EU. And ours is still considerably higher than the EU average. You don't point that out.
Well, they've got... it's a magic equation then, isn't it? They've got your taxation system and they've got the freedom that comes in the billowing cushion of the EU.
Because the EU is now trying to stop them having that taxation system, and they've just had an enormous fine and billions of euros for having a competitive tax system for Google, or anyway, one of the major...
And the EU average is below ours, and it doesn't work for most countries. You really do need to opt out and have this super low tax. And then, of course, the money cascades in. They get 4 times as much per head from companies by having half our tax rate. Why can't our Treasury get it? It's just hopeless.
Indeed it is. Anyway, thank you to my most formidably forceful panel. After the break, I will be talking to the Darlington 5 about the nurses' appalling treatment at the hands of the NHS. Thank you very much.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
When I knew that I was doing this segment this week, I feel like this week was a real homework task for me, because I'll be honest, I haven't been around Scottish food much in my life, but I obviously know all the obvious. And I thought I'd bring in a selection of some of, I guess, the sort of the quintessential culinary delights of the North. I mean, we have in front of us haggis.
I think we should begin with some haggis.
So, Michael, I've never eaten haggis before. This is going to be the first time.
Well, have you eaten anything like haggis before? Have you eaten anything that is made from the intestines of an animal?
I mean, I've had things like chopped liver and, you know, a bit of offal here and there.
Well, there we are. I mean, I got a great surprise. I was holding a great... When I was in government, I was holding a great party in Scotland, and I had a lot of Spanish visitors, and I was offering them haggis, and I thought that they would be astonished by haggis and maybe repelled. But when they ate it, they said, oh, no, this is morcilla. So, you know, there is an equivalent in Spain.
Yes, absolutely.
So if I recall, and you've probably been mugging it up, which I have not, but haggis is made within the stomach of a sheep.
Yes.
And you take the heart and the lungs and some other part of the sheep and you mash it up.
With onions, oatmeal, suet.
Yes.
And it's stuffed into the sheep's stomach. But a lot of the haggis you get these days, especially sort of the slightly cheaper varieties in supermarkets, it's usually an artificial casing. Oh. You know what? This is actually quite nice.
I think it's absolutely heavenly. And
it's very savoury.
To me, it's two things. Yes, to me, it's two things. It's both the taste and the texture. You quite rightly refer to the oatmeal going in there. So it's got this crunchy, granular sort of texture. Marvellous.
GB News, the People's Channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here
We do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We were talking about Trump and Angela Eagle and economic growth. And we've had a mailmog in that says, good evening. Please ask Tessa Dunlop a simple question. Does she think that Israel should exist? If so, how, when surrounded by enemies? Well, I'll keep that question because we've got something else to move on to. 5 NHS nurses have come forward about being forced into a humiliating locker room after they voiced concern over sharing a changing room with a transgender colleague. The nurses, dubbed the Darlington 5, went public and launched legal action in June after they were told by bosses that they should be re-educated and should broaden their mindset. Well, I'm joined now by 2 of the nurses themselves, Bethany Hutchinson and Lisa Lockie, who have been represented by the Christian Legal Centre. Well, thank you both, Bethany and Lisa, for joining me. Can you tell me exactly what happened? You went to the changing room and a biological male expected to be able to change in there as well. Is that right?
Yeah. Do you want me to go? We were told by a colleague actually who'd come across the individual first that there was somebody using the changing room. The trust never told us, and I think really part of the policy said that the trust should actually have informed us of the situation, but we weren't told at all. We were kind of just left to find out for ourselves. So it was like a case of walking into the changing room, hearing a man's voice and thinking, oh, I've come through the wrong door, to then sort of feeling uncomfortable of, what do I do now? I don't really feel like I want to get changed in front of him and that sort of thing. So, yeah, we kind of were all left to find out individually.
Mm-hmm. So you had no notice of this. You were using your changing room in the normal way, and you discovered that there was a man in there who identified as a woman but actually looked and sounded like a man. They hadn't had an operation or anything, and therefore you assumed you were in a room with a man.
Yeah, basically.
And this was then your fault, and you were told you had to be re-educated, which is sort of term used by communist China for people who disagree with things, not one you'd expect from the NHS. What did you say when you were told you had to be re-educated?
I mean, we were appalled, weren't we? We have to have a degree in order to be a nurse, and some of these nurses have multiple degrees, so we are educated, and we are allowed to have this opinion of things as well.
There's a certain level of gaslighting where I actually did start to question myself and thought, am I this really horrible, discriminatory person? But actually, having sort of thought about it, I thought, well, no, I'm not. I don't have a problem with anybody, but I do have a problem when the trust try to tell me that I should feel comfortable taking my clothes off in front of a man I don't know.
No, that's quite something to expect. And the trust then expected you to change in the lockers, but did the lockers have any facilities with them you could change? Were they a private space?
So we've been now given, the trust have given us, so we had a massive changing room that's used by sort of theatre staff, ITU staff, our ward staff, doctors, surgeons, anaesthetists. So there's one for the females, one for the males. And then we've sort of, since we've put this complaint across, we've been given, our manager's office was cleared out, and keypads being put on the door. But it is off the main corridor of the ward, and it's right opposite a side room. So we have noticed if anybody was walking past and you were mid-undress, they'd get a lovely eyeful as they walked past.
Yeah, and it's not an appropriate size for the number of nurses that are actually using it. It's not appropriate.
There's only actually 6 lockers.
And wouldn't you have thought that if there's only one transgender member of staff, it would be sensible to make the arrangements for the one transgender member of staff rather than for all the women who actually want a private changing space?
Yes, well, you would think so, but I think transgender ideology seems to have infiltrated the policies in the NHS and in our trust particularly. So it's just a great shame that they're choosing a transgender person over, you know, I mean, 95% of the staff are female nurses. So it's, I mean, it's made us feel extremely ostracised, this change in, or locker room as they refer to it. And when we originally went in, there was no lockers. It was just completely bare. There was maybe a chair and a hook on the door. We had to leave our belongings on the floor, so it posed a sort of security risk and also an infection control risk. You know, we're leaving our shoes on the floor alongside our clothes. It's just totally inappropriate.
And doesn't this get to the heart of the whole transgender ideology, that it's the rights of women that get trampled upon, that safe spaces for women, private spaces for women get invaded by people who are biologically men. And then when they object, they're told they're the bad people.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened.
And that's how it's made us feel.
Yeah.
That if we complain, that we're going to be punished for complaining about changing in front of a biological male, a man.
There is a real fear, like amongst a lot of our colleagues, that they really are frightened to speak up about it. They're terrified they're going to get into trouble. I mean, we've been sort of threatened for speaking to the media about, you know, we've been threatened that we were going to be subject to disciplinary action. So a lot of the girls it's very much a silencing from the trust. They're wanting to silence us. But sorry, well, I didn't.
You're clearly not going to be silenced, and thank you for coming on this evening. You've taken a legal action. You started that. How far are you in the legal process, and what do you want to get out of the legal process?
We want a policy change. That's what we want. We want them to have it. We want Wes Streeton to honour his promise of getting in touch and to intervene. And to have a look at the policies around this issue, because there's not really anything to protect women in place at the moment. And a lot of women have been silenced. We have heard that we weren't the first people to complain about this, but people have been told to shut up, and the threats had worked and it had silenced people. So for us, we want other women to be aware and to actually to join this sort of this battle against it, just to gain some more support. We just want to kind of stop things in the tracks.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much, Bethany and Lisa. I so admire your courage. I hope you'll come back on and tell me what happens. And I really loathe this idea of re-education. It has a Maoist ring to it. A County Durham and Darlington NHS Foundation Trust spokesman said additional alternative arrangements have been put in place. These include a private lockable changing room and an office which has been converted into a locker room for the storage of belongings. Well, there you go. Anyway, up next, it's the great Patrick Christys. Patrick, it's nice to have you back. You had an evening off, which is so unusual. What have you got on your programme tonight?
Yes, OK, so Keir Starmer promised homes for heroes, all right, but now it looks as though brave military veterans will not be given priority housing, even when it comes to asylum seekers or illegal immigrants, which is remarkable. There is a non-stop scandal taking place at the heart of the Labour Party. Is Keir Starmer lying about why he lived at Lord Alley's pad, and did he break COVID rules? And should Philip Schofield ever be allowed back on television?
Oh, that's all going to be extremely interesting. You're on a strong wicket this evening, Patrick. That's coming up with the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jake Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and you want to know that in Somerset, the sun will be shining beautifully tomorrow. An Indian summer for a few more days in Somerset.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather.
on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to the latest forecast from the Met Office for GB News. Rain for many of us over the next 24 hours. Heavy in places once again, but there will be a few clear spells around, particularly in the far south and the far north. As this low pressure sends its frontal systems north, they will stall across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England during the rest of the day. And that rain will turn heavy at times, especially for southeast Scotland, northeast England, where there is the risk of localised flooding through the day on Thursday because of the amount of rain we're expecting to fall. Further south, showers soon follow the main area of rain, a gusty wind and a mild night to come. A colder night for northern Scotland, where there will be some sunshine first thing on Thursday. Actually, Caithness, Sutherland, Western Scotland, the place to be for blue skies during Thursday morning. Showers, though, will start to move in from the north. Some patchy cloud around through central Scotland, but south of the Central Belt we've got a lot of damp weather, as well as for Northern